Let's get cracking. So our last class we started the Mishnah again. We started the Mishnah at the end of the class. So let's start the Mishnah again, and we'll begin from there. We are on 17a3, otherwise known as in the new book Hazaku Baruch. For all those that waited all this time. Where's Ray? Ray is here every week, and he missed the 1 week where he doesn't have to do it on his phone. Ray, we need you. Okay. Hakuret megillah lemafreya lo yatsa. Someone reads the Megillah. Lemafreya usually means backwards. Okay? But over here we don't mean it backwards. We mean where it's not in order. So you went, let's say 1, then you went 3, then you went 2. So in that measure, that's why it's called backwards. But it means if you read it out of order. Okay? So lo yatsa. He did not fulfill his obligation to hear the Megillah. When we say lo yatsa, generally in this Mishnah we mean you did not fulfill your obligation even b'di'evid. So even if you did it that way, you have to go listen to it again. We'll see there's an example where it's not that case, but we'll come back to it. Let's say you read the Megillah by heart. Okay? Read the Megillah by heart. Or if you read it either in Targum or any language. Targum usually means translation. So what's the difference translation and translation? So Targum is translation specifically in Aramaic. Aramaic had a holier or a stronger connection to Hebrew, so therefore we thought maybe if it's an elevated level, like the language of the Gemara, it was a language of the Tanaim, of the Amoraim. So is that something that would count as more? The Gemara, the Mishnah is big mechadesh. No. So you read it by heart, or you read it either in Targum or in any other language, right? Lo yatsa, you did not fulfill your obligation. We'll see in a minute what that means. But you can read the Megillah, lilo azot, for those that speak another language. What does la'az mean? La'az is an abbreviation. Lashon avodah zarah. So lo'azi means the language of avodah zarah. And that was a euphemism that they used to describe anyone who wasn't Jewish. And that became, you should just know, that became a huge problem for the Jewish people. This word, using the language, calling non-Jews of their avodah zarah, became a huge problem. Why? Because when the censors got a hold of the Tanakh, of the Torah, of the Gemara, of the Mishnayot, anytime they saw a reference to akum, what does akum mean? Koi. But what does it stand for? Ovdeh, kochavim, umazalot. So they immediately just took a black pen and they scribbled over the whole line. They would confiscate everyone's Gemarot and censor or cut it out. So the Jewish people lost pieces of the Gemara. Now, later on, especially in Masechet Avodah Zarah, and in Sanhedrin as well, there are pieces specifically which relate to Jesus that were taken out, but that we have surviving Gemarot, and they're put back in small letters.
Do you think the rabbi censored some of those things?
So there's a big question exactly who censored it. Even the ones that say that the rabbis censored some of it, they censored only the most dangerous of the materials.
What does that mean?
That means that if the Gemara said that the Jewish people did X to whatever, then you don't want that used against us. Okay?
That were like incriminating or whatever.
Okay.
Most offensive.
So, but coming back here, the Mishnah is telling us if you have a person who speaks lo'azit, that means that they speak, let's say they speak English. So the Gemara, the Mishnah says you could read it to someone who speaks English in English. V'halo'ez sheshama ashurit, someone who speaks English, who hears it in Hebrew. Ashurit is generally a term which refers to the style of writing. So as an example, what's ktav ashurit? The way your Sefer Torah is written. If you're writing in script, that's not ashurit, okay? But over here, we're using ashurit to describe not just the style of writing, but even the language itself, Hebrew, okay? So someone who speaks English, who hears the Megillah in Hebrew, right? Yatsa, he has fulfilled his obligation. Now, what the Mishnah seems to be saying here, and this is just super interesting, is that you could read a Megillah in Hebrew for anybody. Whatever they understand, doesn't matter. You could read a Megillah in English for a guy who speaks English. But most opinions hold, that's the opinion we're going to go with for when we're learning this. You could read it in English for a guy who only speaks English. Let's say you read in English for a guy who speaks German. Read in English for a guy who speaks Hebrew, but not English. Lo yatsa. But the chidush is that many opinions hold that if a guy speaks English and Hebrew, he's not yotzeh if he hears it in English.
Wow.
Now, why would that be? Because I'm on Duolingo and now I speak 2 languages. So now you're going to find me, right? Marshawn Lynch.
But what if his
I'm just here so I don't get fined. What's going on?
what if his primary language is English? He's not fluent in Hebrew.
What do you mean?
He's not like I could speak Hebrew, but I'm not fluent in it. I can't go to Israel and blah, 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 blah.
Doesn't matter. Do you understand it?
Just hire me.
I don't-
I'll be your driver and your.
If you don't understand a word of Hebrew.
Shalom, yeah. I'm learning it now. I understand it.
Okay, I think you probably count.
What?
By the way, in Hebrew it's shpidosh. Yeah. But what's it called? In general, I would say that what's it called? That if a person has such a weak Hebrew that they have no clue of the structure of the story, that's what we're referring to. So I want to go through this. I want to explain this just so we understand. So again, Hebrew is a catch-all. English is only if you speak English, and only if you only speak English. Now that's a chidush. Not all the authorities hold that way. Some hold that you're allowed to read it in English if you understand it in English. You're allowed to read it in Hebrew if you understand Hebrew. But you can't read it in English if you only understand German. Okay? So how do we understand this? The lechatechila, the ideal state, is Hebrew. B'di'evid, we were willing to allow you to read it in English. Why? Because the point of Megillah is Pirsumei Nisa, to spread the word of the miracle. If you don't have a clue of what's going on in Hebrew, we wanted to allow a person who speaks English to understand it in the language that he speaks. Okay? Since that's the case, if you speak Hebrew and English, you no longer are allowed to use the loophole of what's it called? Of English. Why? Because you understand Hebrew. So you go back to the ideal scenario. So really, ideally Hebrew. If a guy can't understand a single word, I'd rather you read it in English than in Hebrew because you'll understand what's going on. However, if you understand also Hebrew, so then we don't allow you to read it in English. But Hebrew, you're always allowed to read it in, and you're always going to be yotzeh. Okay? Why that is something we're going to have to address. The point is, Pirsumei Nisa, you read it in Hebrew, no clue what's going on. So I have an answer to that. Anyone want to offer an answer to that? You guys understand the question? How could the point be spreading the word of the miracle? And how could you be yotzeh in Hebrew if you don't understand the word in Hebrew? You should have to read it in English. Lechatechila. So I have a simple answer to this question. There's 2 levels. If we were in Brisk, we would say, it's not zwei dinim. There's two laws, right? There's 2 parts of Pirsumei Nisa, of spreading the word of the miracle. One is in understanding and telling the story. But there's another thing that we do because of Pirsumei Nisa, to spread the word of the miracle. What else is a famous mitzvah that we do for the sake of Pirsumei Nisa? To spread Chanukah. We light Hanukkah candles. Did anyone tell you the story when you lit Hanukkah candles? No, you just light the candles. But that in and of itself, the action is Pirsumei Nisa, because people will ask, why are we doing this thing? What are we doing? How come? The answer is, there were the Maccabees, the Greeks, the Assyrians, they got together, they had children, Assyrian Greeks, Hazaku Baruch, they attacked Beit HaMikdash, they forced all sorts of problems. So the Pirsumei Nisa isn't the full telling of the story. It's doing a thing which will cause the story. So if you understand the Megillah, Megillah has 2 layers of Pirsumei Nisa. One, the action of reading, which causes people to say what's going on, how come we're doing this, and gets the conversation started. And the second thing is the actual conversation. Megillah has 2, Chanukah has 1. But you see from Chanukah that even if you only have 1, it's still Pirsumei Nisa. So therefore, if you speak English, we allowed you to have it in English so you could have both. But if you speak Hebrew and English, I'd rather you do it in the original way. And yes, I understand that I lost the second layer, but for the sake of the authenticity of the writing and reading in Hebrew, I'd rather you do it in Hebrew if you understand Hebrew.
Megillah written in Farsi for the people who didn't understand.
We're going to come to that. Okay, let's carry on. So the Mishnah continues. Let's say a person read and he stopped reading, and he read and he stopped reading, and he read and he stopped reading. Why do you do that? It's a good question.
Fell asleep.
Sorry?
Fell asleep.
Oh, so if it says umitnamnem, or he fell asleep, then that means that the first one can't be because he fell asleep. Now, by the way, you're not wrong, because there's a way to read the Mishnah. He read it not in order, umitnamnem, and he's falling asleep. But most people don't understand the Mishnah. It's not an and, it's an or. So there's two ways to read it, this without continuation. One way is karasirugin, a little bit. Another way is where he read it and he fell asleep, and then he read it. But either way, the end point is the same. He read it in tranches, in split. I remember once it happened to me. I never understood what this Mishnah means. And then it happened to me. What happened? We had one of these like late night megillah readings. I went to a shul in Israel. I'm not going to say the name of the shul. They were throwing. Okay, you know how everyone goes nuts and they bang on the table, they do this, or they do cap guns or whatever. I was in a shul. They were throwing M80s.
Oh my God.
M80 is the fire crack. You know the one that you hear in the summer? Not the those are jumping jacks. An M80 is a quarter stick of dynamite. Boom. What's his name? If I'm not mistaken, JPP was holding an M80 when he blew off 3 of his fingers. That's how powerful an M80 is. So people were throwing them in shul. So you hear boom like that. I had no doubt that I was not Yotzei Megillah, because there were words I didn't hear because I couldn't have hearing. Okay, you hear Okay, so we left. We tried to find the late reading. Went to this guy's house. Tons of people, lots of ladies. Who didn't hear Megillah. Anyway, every 3 minutes, the guy had to stop reading Megillah for 2 minutes. Why? Because some kid pooped his pants.
Oh, yeah.
You're not allowed to read if there's a bad smell. Now there's a bad smell, small apartment, a lot of people. Takes a minute till the air's out, till you're allowed to keep reading. And then I read this Mishnah, and I was like, oh, that was that night. Someone who reads discontinuously, doesn't, he stops here and there. So you don't read. Remember, what's the point of this and of Limafreya? The idea of it is, the story only gives you the perspective of God's intervention when you can see all the pieces together. If it's disjointed, stop, go. Each and every bit by itself could be a coincidence that happened to happen. But it's when you see it in its entirety that you see God's fingerprints. So that's the logic, but we'll see how we learn the halakha specifically from the sources.
But it says you're yotzeh.
Sorry?
If you read it discontinuously, you're yotzeh.
As opposed to the mafreya. So in other words, it's enough. The Mishnah's chidush is, when you read it disjointed but continuously, it's enough for you to be, even though you might have lost the thread, when you read the mafreya, then we say no. Okay? Because
when you went to Israel, you don't believe that you fulfilled your obligations.
no, I just believe that that's this Mishnah. The Mishnah says Yatzah. But what is the Mishnah coming to tell you? Because I would have thought, Limafreya, same logic, you don't see the story because you broke it in half and half and half. The answer is, no, but so long as you read it in order, those breaks in between, they're like commercials. You still got the movie. Okay, let's move on. By the way, I wish I would see a Rashi. Kemo ha-movie. Okay, fine. Haya kotva, someone wrote it, dosha umagia. So he's writing the Megillah. Or he is, dosha, he's giving a class in the Megillah. Or umagia, or he's correcting the Megillah. But as he's doing this, in order to be able to do it properly, he's reading, Vayehi bime Achashverosh. Hu Achashverosh, Amolech meod. He's doing it, writing. But he said every word. It says the Megillah, Im kiven lebo yatsa. If he had in mind, there's 2 opinions as to what this means. Morris is saying at the bottom as we speak. Im kiven, if he intended to be yotzeh, then he's yotzeh. Now, why is that a matter of dispute? Because there's an age-old machloket with regards to the concept of mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. What happens if I do a mitzvah and I don't have kavanah to do the mitzvah, but I did the mitzvah? So I said, Baruch atah Hashem HaKadosh, an netilat ulah. But I didn't think to myself, I am fulfilling the mitzvah of shaking a lulav. Was I yotzeh, yes or no? Big machloket, 2 sides. One says mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. One says mitzvot ena tzrichot kavanah. Now, every time in the Gemara and the Mishnah, there'll be a Mishnah that seems to side like one side, the other side is put on notice. What's going on? Mishnah. So they have to answer. So over here, each side answers it according to their opinion.
Yeah.
The side of mitzvot tzrichot kavanah says, that's what it means. If you had in mind that I want to fulfill the mitzvah, you were yotzeh. If not, you're just writing, you had no intention to fulfill it, you're not yotzeh. The other opinion says, what do you mean? Mitzvot enan tzrichot kavanah. So what does it mean over here in kiven libo yatsa? The answer is, it doesn't mean that you intended to fulfill the mitzvah. It means were you paying attention to get it right. What would that mean? What would that mean? So one idea is pronunciation. But I think that there's other elements here as well. Can I give you an example? Let's say the guy is writing. He says, Vayihi bimeh Achashverosh. Stop, start, that's discontinuous, that's fine. But what would not be good? So if you're writing slowly, Vayihi bimeh, normally we'd say hefsek. Normally we'd say hefsek, but hefsek is not a problem. Because this discontinuous is not a problem. So what could be the issue? So one is pronunciation properly. You know, what else?
He wrote it wrong?
The writing is not relevant. The only reason why we have the writing is that's the scenario within which he is saying the words out loud. So what do you think? There's one other thing with regards to kiven libo. Let's say he's correcting. And he doesn't need to correct every word.
So he skips?
So what if he skips a word?
No,
That's kiven libo. Kiven libo means I don't trust that you said every word unless you intended to fulfill your obligation. Because if you didn't intend to fulfill your obligation, then afterwards you're like, oh, I just did the Megillah. You don't know that you did that. Because when you were doing it, you had the correcting the Megillah hat on, not the reading the Megillah hat on. So you weren't being careful to make sure you didn't skip a word. Yeah.
If you're correcting and you're a legit guy, you have to read every word.
No.
Of course.
No. Why?
What do you mean? Then you can't correct.
Let me give you an
How do
example.
you know it's a mistake?
Let me give you an example. I look at the Megillah,
Yeah.
I see the word Vayihi. I just have to see it.
You
I see it. I know that's right. So then I'm like, okay, Bimeh.
Oh, you're saying you don't read it?
He may have skipped a word in saying it out
You
loud.
can utter it.
Yes.
He may have
Yes.
skipped the uttering.
No, but you have to say it.
Yes, you must.
Okay, so
Because
see, I told you.
you know, how many times do we have to tell you out here? Right? You guys understand this? So kiven libo means, maybe one opinion is that it means if you hold mitzvot tzrichot kavanah, it means that you had intention to fulfill your obligation. If you don't hold it, it means did you pronounce it correctly? But I think that there's other scenarios where if you didn't have an intention to fulfill your obligation, it's not that you're not yotzeh because you need kavanah. It's that you're not yotzeh because we're worried you didn't actually read it all. Okay? Let's carry on. Says the Megillah. I have other pshatim as well, by the way. What other pshatim do I have? He might have done one of the other things. Like as an example, maybe, because he knows it by heart, he read some words al peh.
But
You
you're still
understand?
looking at it.
No, so he goes Vayihi.
NG.
Vayihi, then he looks at the book. Or, because he's just correcting, he doesn't think he needs to, so he's reading it, Vayihi bimeh Ahashverosh, hu Ahashverosh, give me the quote, hu Ahashverosh, Hamolech. Now he scans it, but when did he say those words? Was he looking? Without looking.
I have a question for
So
you.
if you're paying attention to be yotzeh, you're going to make sure you're not kara al peh. If you're not trying to fulfill your obligation to read, you're just correcting. You may say every word. You may do everything correctly, but you may have looked out of the book.
But this is only at the time that one will be on the 14th of Adar.
Correct.
If I'm correcting it on the
Obviously.
23rd of July.
Obviously, yes.
So we have a Baal Koder reading the Megillah.
Yeah.
And he does what you just did. Right? He just looks up for a second.
Huge problem.
Wow.
You should just, I want to tell you something. Cham David Yosef used to stand when he would read. I don't know if you ever see. When he stands over here when he reads the Sefer. Anyway, someone came to him, and they're like, why? He goes, you know what? He started getting very emotional actually. He said, people think that when I'm doing that, I'm doing it to show off. Like I'm standing over here. He says, no. He says, I know the Pesukim by heart. But if you read it not from the Torah, you're not Yotzeh. So when I stand far away, I have to squint and focus in order to see the words. And that forces me to read every word from the Torah. So I stand far away in order to ensure that I'm fulfilling the mitzvah. Isn't that gorgeous?
Most people do the opposite.
The opposite.
They're
I
in there.
can't see, so I would do it.
They're in there.
It just
Right?
depends
No, but
on your
that's-
sight.
Right.
Depends on your sight. But it's a
That
perfect
hits.
example of judging someone not favorably. Okay, let's continue. Gemara says, "In kivein bo yatsa, bim lav, if not lo yatsa." Now the Mishnah says, "Hayita kiduva." Now I just want you guys to realize that there's three parts to this Mishnah. What's the first part of the Mishnah? First part of the Mishnah describes, well, actually multiple parts in the beginning of the Mishnah, but the first part of the Mishnah describes reading, and reading it in which language, how you read and what you read. Now the second part of this Mishnah that we're looking at, the Mishnah is now going to talk about the process of the writing itself. Okay? Hayita kituva b'sam u'b'sikra u'b'kumuz u'b'kankantum. We'll see what each of these is in the Gemara. Four different kinds of ink. Al haniyar or al hadiftara, on these two different types of writing, things that accept writing. Two different types of well, not really paper, but something that you'll write on. We'll see exactly what niyar and diftara is. Okay? Lo yatsa, did not fulfill your obligation if it was written on that. Ad sheteheh, until it's written, kituba ashurit al hasefer ubidyo. Simple, if you look at it on a simple level, there's three conditions. Has to be written, black ink, let's start backwards. Diyo doesn't only mean black ink, it means black ink that won't become rubbed out, right? It has to be written on parchment, sefer is parchment. And the third condition is ashurit. And the question is, what does ashurit mean? Because the way the Mishnah just said it, the Mishnah just expressed that it has to be written in Hebrew, in ashurit, but we just said earlier that you could read the Megillah in English. And remember, if you're reading the Megillah, you allowed to read it by heart? No. So how are you reading it in English, not by heart, from a Megillah that's written in Hebrew?
Is that the translator we learned about when there was a Baal Korah and a translator?
Irrelevant. Yeah, hold on. Irrelevant. Why? Because if the translator's translating from Hebrew, and you don't speak Hebrew, you're yotzeh anyway with the Hebrew. So maybe that just helps me understand. I don't care about the translator now. How about if I read it in English and the book is in Hebrew? So I'm reading, and it was in the days of Achashverosh.
You have to use the same font.
It would be a problem. Now it's interesting. In all the commentators, no one says Ashurit just means a font. Because that would solve all the problems. So you have some mifarshim that take out the word Ashurit.
Oh, wow.
Because the Mishnah said you could have a Megillah in English.
But it also says Ashurit in Megillah beforehand also.
Where?
Earlier. Then we said we learned
That's
that
but that's
before.
Hebrew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't now just disregard Ashurit.
No. The fact that the Mishnah here says it's a qualitative statement that a Megillah is not kosher until it's written like this. That means that, what do you mean? You just told me the other Megillah is kosher. If you tell me that a Megillah is kosher if it has this, there are other Megillahs that are also kosher. But if you tell me ad sheteheh,
Not unless.
I think it's for those Megillot that are written in Hebrew.
so it's that's a hard thing to say. Why? Because the first in the contract law, let's say I'm writing a part of the contract that relates to everything, and in that section I describe something that doesn't relate to everything. Or I say, as an example, all the tenants have to clean their porch and must, pay their rent on the 30th. Would anyone say that to pay the rent on the 30th is only for people who have a pre-arranged? You would say it goes for everybody. So when we just started saying that the writing needs to be in certain kinds of ink, who's that referring to? Every Megillah. So all of a sudden you're going to give me now another thing, and that's only relating to the Hebrew Megillot? So one opinion says, yes, it's talking about, why? The most ideal Megillah. Because remember, if you want a Megillah that everyone in the world could be yotzeh with, it's the one in Ashurit. Why? Because if it's in English, German guy can't be yotzeh. If it's in Russian, Polish guy can't be yotzeh. So the Mishnah gave you what is a Megillah that is kosher for sure for everybody. Ashurit, Tio, Sefer. That's one opinion. Second opinion, take out the word Ashurit. Third opinion, every Megillah, even if it's written in English, has to be written in Hebrew letters. So, and it was Aleph Nun Dalid, Aleph Tet,
Like the address.
Vav Vav Aleph Zayin, and it was in the days of Achashverosh.
But then you can't read it if you don't know Hebrew.
So maybe it means you don't understand Hebrew, but you know how to read Hebrew. A lot of the other commentators don't like that.
The wedding invitations.
I don't like that. What do you mean?
You said you're allowed to understand Hebrew, even if you're.
No, in other words, I'm writing English words.
Right.
But the Megillah, so the guy who's listening speaks English. The guy who's reading, he understands Hebrew also. But the other guy doesn't. So therefore, this guy doesn't understand Hebrew, he'd rather read it in English. So that Megillah would need to be written in Ketav Ashurit. What's interesting is, not one opinion says that Ashurit describes a font. It needs to be written in Times New Roman. Sans serif.
Microsoft.
Like, by the way, like, if you think that that's crazy, think about the way that they used to write, what's it called? The old, like, documents, the proclamations of the royals. There's like there's a similarity in whatever language you're looking at. It's big blocks, strong letters, right? So maybe that's what Ashurit means. Not one opinion raises that as even a possibility. Which tells you that Ashurit does not mean that.
Does the Megillah have to be written by hand?
Yes.
Why?
There was a massive scandal with silk screen. You know what silk screen is?
I thought it was the roller.
That was one of those genius ideas that only happens to not be kosher.
It's an image instead of.
They create a screen made out of silk with holes in it. They take ink, they go boom. In 1 second, they print an entire page of Torah. It looks, you cannot tell the difference.
Not Torah, Megillah only.
Megillah also has.
Both.
I'm told that there's a group that does this.
There's a group that does everything.
No, very, very from group.
That's a dirty
Not that I know.
word.
No, 1 second.
I know.
One second.
I'm aware of it.
They might have a higher level Megillah, because it's whatever, than a printed one. Because you could use a printed Megillah to follow along. So maybe they want to have a nicer Megillah to follow along. But to say that that's a Megillah that you Yotzei Megillah with, it's harder. It's harder to say.
We'll have an offline conversation.
And by the way, offline conversation, in some ways, the laws of Megillah are more strict than the laws of a Sefer Torah, according to some opinions. Remember when we learned that it has to have sirtut, has to have the scratches, and it says, Kimo Amitah Shel Torah, like the truth of the Torah. One opinion was Amitah Shel Torah means the Sefer Torah. The other opinion is Amitah Shel Torah refers to Tefillin Mezuzot. That Tefillin and Mezuzot have a higher level of sirtut than even a Sefer Torah. Nathan Lowe asked me about that. How can it be that a mezuzah would need a higher level of scratching the lines more than a Sefer Torah? How could that be?
Tefillin you use every day. Sefer Torah 3 times a week.
So what? But still, the Kedusha of Sefer Torah is higher. So the Mifrashim, there's a beautiful understanding in that. The understanding goes that when it comes to a document that's going to be put in a scroll, or stuck in batim, it's hard to call that a sefer. It's hard to call that a kosher, a legal script.
What's a scroll called?
What makes it a legal script is the sirtut. A Sefer Torah, by definition, is the whole corpus of Torah law. So even without the individual level of sirtut, now it still needs outside levels of sirtut, but the idea that on every line, so there's certain things that Megillah is more strict than even a Sefer Torah. So that's
But
that.
what if it has all of that? It has the sirtut, it has everything,
Yeah.
but it's printed like that.
But it's silk
With-
screen.
On parchment with black ink.
So most people hold it's still a problem. We'll see exactly why. Okay, let's continue. Says the Gemara. We'll end in a few minutes. Yes,
Why?
because I have a Brit Milah and then another class.
Okay.
Okay. The Gemara says.
We thought we booked you for the whole. We thought we booked you for the whole day, Rabbi.
Says the Gemara. "Menahani mili." Where? How do we know this idea? You're telling me now that you're reading it out of order, right? That you read it out of order. You're not yotzei. How do we know that? Rabbi says. Let's see the whole pasuk because it's very important to see all of these pasukim together. The pasuk says, look in the inside column there. The first pasuk is pasuk tet. Kimu v'kiblu hayudim alehem. The Jewish people kept and accepted upon themselves, and on their children, and all those that would be reliant upon them, v'lo ya'avor, without having anyone transgress this acceptance, להיות עושים את שני הימים האלה, to do these 2 days, ככתבם וכזמנם, according to the way they were written, and according to their times, בכל שנה ושנה. We've had this pasuk many times before. If you remember before, we learned from the words v'lo ya'avor that you could only go until the 15th, if you remember.
Yeah.
We learned many different laws from this pasuk already. Says Rava, so since it says kichtavam uchizmanam, ma zmanam lemafreya lo, just like in the way, in the times, i.e., which days you could read it on, the 14th and the 15th. You never had the 15th before the 14th, right? It never happened in the history of time. So therefore, also kichtavam uchizmanam, by the fact that Torah puts them, the Megillah puts them together, it's illustrative of the fact that af kitavam lemafreya lo. Also, the writing is not lemafreya. You can't have the writing be out of order. Gemara asks an obvious question. What are you talking about? Midi kriya ktiv kan. This, all it says over here is ktiva, that you can't write it out of order. So in other words, I can't write chapter 1, chapter 4, chapter 2. But who says that once it's written in order, kichtavam uchizmanam, so the ktav is the same as the zman, that I can't read it out of order. So the Gemara knocks out Rava's proof in order to derive this halakha. Asiyah ktiva. So the Gemara says, kitiva ktiva ga asiyah ktivan. It talks about a celebration over here. It talks about a writing over here. Dichtiv liot osim et shnei hayamim, to do these 2 days according to their proper time. So if it doesn't mention kiryah in the pasuk, it just mentions the celebration, it just mentions the writing, you can't derive that the kiryah is that way. Says the Gemara, ela mehacha. From here, dichtiv hayamim ha'elu niskarim v'na'asim. These days are, niskarim means mentioned, v'na'asim and done, and celebrated. Itkish zechiyali asiyah. We brought a hekesh, we connected, remembering the Purim miracle, which is a reading of the Megillah. We connected that with the asiyah. Ma asiyah l'mefreya lo. Just like when it comes to celebrating the day, you can't celebrate them out of order. It doesn't work to have the 14th before the 15th, the 15th before the 14th. So too, av zichira, also the mentioning of the miracle cannot be done lemafreya lo. So we learn from the pasuk, niskarim v'na'asim, that a person can't read the Megillah out of order. By the way, you think that that's obvious. When it comes to Sheva Berachot underneath the chuppah, let's say a guy comes up and it was Beracha 1 was done, you call up the guy for Beracha 2, the guy is very confident, he snatches Beracha number 3. What's the halakha?
Go back to 1.
So people think, oh, you gotta go back to 2 and do 3 again because they're out of order. It's not the halakha. You just read number 2 after number 3.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And then you skip to number 4. That's the halakha. People don't know that, right? But that's an example of things that you're reading out of order. It's not a problem. Okay? What else could you read out of order? Person comes late to tefillah. What do? You do Baruch Shama, you do this one, you do Ashrei, you do this. And then after tefillah, what do? You go back and you do those things. You read it out of order. Maybe you should have to read it again. So not everything that is in an order, even though the order is important, is me'akev lahalacha that you did it in order. Okay? But over here we have a limud that tells us specifically that it is so. Okay. Tana v'chen b'halel, also in halel, is something where if you read it out of order, it's a problem. V'chen b'kiryat shema b'tefillah, also kiryat shema and tefillah, it has to be read in order. What does it mean, kiryat shema and tefillah? It means that there's chapters of kiryat shema, okay?
Shema's read in 3 different phases.
Exactly.
The first one is loving God, it's the first obligation, succeeds last, the third is the last obligation.
So let's say I read the 3rd paragraph first, and then 2nd, and then the 1st.
Would be not okay based
Not-
on what you just said.
It's not okay. So the Gemara is saying that Shema has to be read in order. Amidah, you can't read first, Modim, then Shema Kolenu, then Rifa'enu, then the beginning. It doesn't work that way.
But you could do a shortened Amidah if you're not in a safe place.
A shortened Amidah is its own sequence.
Got it. So it's
But when you're doing the Amidah of 18 or 19 Berachot after they instituted the 19th Beracha, then the Berachot need to be in order, and there's a specific reason why it is set in that order. Gemara says, okay, how do we know this? Halel minalan. How do I know that Halel needs to be in a specific order? Gemara says, Rabba Amar, Tichtiv mimizrach shemesh ad mevo'o. From the east, the rising of the sun, right? Ad mevo'o, until where it comes. So when the sun rises in the east and goes into the west, it never rises in the west and goes into the east. So therefore, mimizrach shemesh ad mevo'o. Now, what's the end of the pasuk? Mehulal Shem Amonai. This is one of those examples that the Gemara skips the main part of what it's telling you because it assumes you're already a Talmid Chacham. It gives you the pasuk, but the pasuk doesn't tell you anything that the Gemara brings. Look at the whole pasuk on the side. Mimizrach shemesh ad mevo'o mehulal Shem Amonai. From the setting of the sun until the rising of the sun until the setting, that's how mehulal Shem Amonai, the God's name is praised. But if you praised God's name west to east, backwards, it doesn't count. So again, the Gemara doesn't give you the main part of the proof. Rav Yosef Amar, Rav Yosef says, Ze hayom asa Amonai. This is the day that God made. Nagila v'nismecha bo. The same concept. So, Ze hayom asa Amonai, the way that the day is created, Nagila v'nismecha bo, we will also rejoice and celebrate in it. So if a person wants to be able to bring the joy of Hallel, which is Hallel is supposed to be said with that kind of feeling and excitement, the only way you could do it is in the order of Ze hayom asa Amonai, in the order that it was created. Rav Avya Amar, Rav Avya says, Yishem Amonai Mevorach, right? Let's take a look. Where's the full pasuk? Take a look on the side. Me'ata ve'ad olam. You want to bless Hashem's name, Me'ata, from now until forever. So here the Gemara skips the other part of the proof. Not the connection to the prayer part. It skips the part where it's telling you from now until forever, which is the order of time. So we have three different proofs that so far that teach us that Hallel needs to be said in order. Gemara says, Rav Nachman says, he learned it from here. Me'ata ve'ad olam. From now until forever. Now, what is the difference between the first opinion and the second opinion? What's the difference between Rav Avya and Rav Nachman? Anyone know? So it's very interesting. There's a line that we're going to come across in just a minute. Okay? Right as we turn the page. Right? Kriyat Shema. Right? Let's learn the line and then we'll come back to it. Okay? Says the Gemara. Kriyat Shema, when it comes to reading of the Shema, how do we know that it has to be done in order? And if it's not done in order, you're not yotzei. The Tanya, in the Braita, Kriyat Shema kichtava. Kriyat Shema, the reading of Shema, needs to be done according to the way it was written. It can't be in another language. Chachamim say in any language. Why did Rebbe say that Kriyat Shema needs to be read in Hebrew? Amar Kira, the pasuk tells us, V'hayu hadivarim ha'eleh, and these words should be on your heart. V'hayu b'haviyatan yehu, and these words should be. How should they be? In the way that they are, they should remain.
So one is implied, one is a must.
What do you mean one is implied?
He is like it should be.
Okay.
But the other one says you have to do it that way.
Which other one?
The
Excellent. So the Gemara brings a derasha here that the word v'hayu or the word yehi says this is how it is, this is how it has to be. Okay? So the idea of hu b'haviyatan yeheh is an idea we find all over Shas. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have the Beit HaMikdash and you're missing one of the kelim. The whole Beit HaMikdash is pasul. Let's say you have the Beit HaMikdash, okay? And you move the Beit HaMikdash 5 feet one way. When did we learn this? In what context, remember?
The Mishkan.
No, not the Mishkan. We learned that when we're talking about the Jewish people getting permission to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash.
I thought there was in contrast with the Mishkan. I thought we talked about it. That sounds very familiar.
You know the bamot around.
I'm not talking about the Bamot. I'm talking about building the Beit HaMikdash, but exactly where it's supposed to be, 3 feet to the north. The whole thing shifted. Or 3 feet to the south, west or east. We learned it in the Gemara where the Jewish people were given permission by the king of Persia to go rebuild the temple. And then their permission was rescinded.
Oh, yes.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And I asked you, how did he rescind the permission?
Moving it.
When
10
something is
10
written
feet that
and
way.
sealed with the sign of the king in the Hashid, it can't go back. So what do we learn in the Megillah? You don't change the OG decree. What do?
Add to it.
You add to the old decree. So what did he add to the old decree?
By the way, you gotta go.
He
10
said,
feet
by the way,
that
no problem. You can carry on building Beit HaMikdash. Just has to be built 3 feet this way. The whole Beit HaMikdash now, unbuildable. Okay? Where do we learn these ideas from? Many of them from this concept. I told you it has to be like this. It has to be like this, not like anything else. So the first opinion, and again, what I find so interesting is that the Gemara is expecting you, by giving you these two opinions, normally you read the Gemara, you'd understand that the first opinion is saying, Yishem Abraham Borach, Me'atav Ad Olam. Hashem should be blessed from now until forever. Just like from now until forever, blah, blah, blah. But then the second opinion says that that's the derajah. So the first opinion can't be that. So what's the first opinion? But you didn't bring that derajah until the next Gemara. It's interesting, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So the Gemara says, so why does Rebbe say that a person needs to read in Hebrew? The answer is, V'hayu v'haviyatan yehu. They have to be as they are now. So therefore, a person needs to read Kiryat Shema only in Hebrew. V'rabanan maitamayu. How come the rabbis hold that you can read Shema in any language? Amakra Shema. The pasuk says Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel. B'chol lashon sha'ata shomea. Since the purpose, the point here is for you to hear it, the point is not to say it, it's that it should be heard. That means that in whatever way you're prepared to hear it, that's how you should hear it. So the Chachamim understood in the word Shema a more open interpretation, allowing for Shema to be read in any language that someone understands. The Gemara says, okay, and now this is one of those scenarios where each time we see what one person learns, we have to ask what does the other person do with that limud. So the Gemara asks, Rebbe Nami Haktiv Shema. Rebbe also has the word Shema in his Shema. And Shema, if it's an open interpretation, and Rebbe does not learn that allows you to read in any language, what does he do with that? The Gemara says, Hahu Mebayele, he needs the word Shema to understand a different halakha. Hashma le'oznecha mashtamotzev picha. You can't read Shema like this. You have to say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem, minimal. You have to say it loud enough that your ears can hear what your mouth is saying. So therefore, the reading of Shema needs to be done audibly. Okay? The Gemara says, well, okay, if that's how Rabbi Yehuda understands that lesson, the Chachamim also understand that. Rabbanan Savri, Keman de Amar HaKorea, Et Shema v'lo shmei le'oznav, Yatza. So the Chachamim, if they don't have the word Shema to teach you that, they must hold, because they don't have that open for that derashah. So they must hold that if you say Shema and you did not hear what you said, but you whispered it quietly and it came out of your mouth, you didn't hear what you said, still you fulfill your obligation. By the way, that does not mean that the Chachamim say that you could scan Shema with your eyes. They still hold you have to say it, but it just doesn't have to be loud enough that you could hear it. Now I'm thinking, what do you mean?
By definition, if you say, you can hear it.
Oh, so what's the difference? Let's say there's any noise in the room.
Uh-huh.
So halakha according to Rabbi Yehuda would be, you have to keep elevating.
Or lip singing.
You have to keep elevating it, right? According to the Rabbanan, no, there's no mitzvah for you to hear it, okay? Because why do we say Shema? Not that you should hear what you're saying, but rather you should understand what you're saying. Okay, Gemara says, the Rabbanan Nami, but the Rabbanan now have one piece that they did not deal with, one more piece of the puzzle that's left outstanding. Rabbi Yehuda took the word Vehayu and said, Hu behaviyatan yeheh, that it has to be read in the way that it was written. Why? Because it says Vehayu. V'aktiv hayu, Vehayu. Gemara answers, Hahu mebayele shelo yikara lemafreya. It has to be in the way that it was written, not meaning that it needs to be written in the language it was written, but rather it needs to be read in the order that it was written, which is in order but not out of order. The Gemara says, Okay, backwards now. Rebbe, it's like a game of tennis or pickleball. Rebbe, so what about Rebbe? Does Rebbe not hold? Shaloi kara, l'mafreya minale. Where does he learn it from? The Gemara says, midevarim hadevarim. The pasuk says, v'hayu hadevarim ha'ele. And these words, why does it say v'hayu hadevarim? It could have said v'hayu divarim ha'ele. What is the extra hey of hadevarim coming to tell you? The Gemara is answering that according to Rebbe's understanding, these are the words, not words. Yani, words you could say whatever way you want. But when these are the words, it's indicating that there's a specificity here that we're pointing out. So hadevarim ha'ele tells Rebbe that that's how you know how to read them, how to read it specifically in order. What's the Gemara's next question going to be? What do the rabbis do with hadevarim? So each time you find one other item, the Gemara now is forced.
It's a tough one.
Right? But you know what the funny thing is? All you need to remember is the ladder. As we go, we're just going to keep volleying the same thing back and forth. Okay, so Gemara asks, okay, what does hadevarim tell them? V'rabanan hadevarim lo mashma lahu. And that's where we end. The Chachamim did not see that there was a specific limud from Devarim Had-Devarim, because that's just the way the Torah talks. It's not adding something extra that you could pin something on, and therefore, at that point, we have the extra piece. Chachamim say, actually, it's not an extra piece. Okay? That's where we ended. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen.